The post-war world didn't rebuild its economic freedom. It rebuilt its dependency. The destruction had wiped out factories, currencies, and confidence, but not the need for a center. And when a system needs a center, it doesn't choose the fairest one. It chooses the one most capable of imposing direction. The dollar occupied that space long before anyone realized it. European economies were empty. Gold was concentrated in American vaults. International trade had collapsed. The planet didn't need a new agreement, it needed a new axis. Bretton Woods simply formalized what was already inevitable. The promise was simple: a stable monetary architecture, an order that would prevent the mistakes that led to the Great Depression, a system where each currency had a defined place, protected by clear rules, but every rule hides a hierarchy. The dollar would be the anchor. All other currencies would orbit around it, and gold would serve as the symbol of neutrality holding everything together, even though it was already out of reach for most. None of this was presented as domination. It was sold as reconstruction. The truth was in the math. The only country with enough liquidity to finance the new order was also the only one with the power to dictate its mechanics. When liquidity and leadership converge, there is no vote. There is inevitability. The conference was merely the public ritual of something already decided. In the hotel halls, delegates debated rates, reserves, and mechanisms. But the real variables were not on the table. They were in American vaults, in the colossal surplus created by the war, in the near-total control over global gold flows. The system wasn't born from idealism, it was born from asymmetry. And that asymmetry was deep enough to last for generations. The world accepted it because it had no alternative. No devastated economy could finance its own reconstruction. No European country had enough reserves to sustain its currency. The world needed credit, and credit always comes with a silent condition: future dependency. That was the real pact of Bretton Woods. Not a monetary agreement, but an architecture of functional subordination. And like every well-designed structure, it looked inevitable. Before we move on, one point. If this analysis makes sense to you, share your view in the comments. We're already inside the mechanism. Gold would operate as the technical limit, the dollar as the political limit, and the IMF would emerge as a correction mechanism for nations unable to stay aligned with the system's axis. It was a closed structure, elegant, and above all, self-centered. And like every structure that looks too stable, the tension wasn't in the components, it was in the design itself. Because by tying the world to the dollar, Bretton Woods tied the dollar to the burden of supporting the world. And no monetary issuer can carry that weight without the cycle eventually folding back onto itself. That is the point marking the transition to the next movement, the causality hidden behind the order. The system looked solid on the surface, but its internal logic was already carrying the seed of its own collapse. The cause wasn't bad management. It was baked into the engine of the agreement itself. For the world to grow, it needed dollars. For the dollar to support the world, it had to expand beyond the gold backing it. This paradox didn't appear in 1971. It started at Bretton Woods. Post-war economies were sitting in a massive capital vacuum. Europe was in ruins. Japan was frozen. Infrastructure destroyed. National currencies with zero credibility. The world needed immediate liquidity just to survive. But gold doesn't respond to human needs, it responds to scarcity. The dollar became the natural substitute, and that created the chain reaction that would define the century. The more the world rebuilt its economies, the more it depended on dollars to run trade, finance deficits, and stabilize broken currencies. Global demand for dollars grew faster than America's ability to supply gold-backed dollars. The system needed to expand, but the gold peg needed to stay fixed. That equation was never going to balance. The Marshall Plan made the asymmetry even bigger. It didn't just rebuild Europe, it rebuilt Europe inside the American financial orbit. Every dollar cent created another layer of functional dependency. Every credit line became another link in the global monetary chain. The IMF and the World Bank were created as shock absorbers for that structure, not referees. Shock absorbers. They didn't fix the system. They kept countries from collapsing before the system reached maturity. The real power sat in the invisible wiring. Fixed exchange rates, controlled flows, deficit rules, restrictions on devaluation. The promise was stability. The reality was forced convergence. Any country that tried to escape deflationary pressure got the same prescription: fiscal tightening, higher reserves, and alignment with the dollar axis. The logic was simple. For the system to work, every nation had to sacrifice monetary autonomy. The dollar didn't dominate through force. It dominated because it was the only instrument capable of preventing immediate collapse in hollowed-out economies. That's the detail almost no one sees. The world wasn't subdued. The world surrendered out of necessity. By the time global trade started breathing again, the hierarchy was already locked in. And when a system is born with asymmetry, it can only evolve toward one destination: rising tension. Starting in the 1950s, Europe's and Japan's rapid growth created a pressure point Bretton Woods was never built to handle. Their exports surged, dollars piled up overseas. And quietly, a question started forming. Gold would never be enough to support a world growing at exponential speed. That was the design flaw. And like every structural flaw, it doesn't show up in the beginning. It shows up when the system hits velocity. The 1960s would ignite the imbalance. But the mechanism was already in place on day one. Here's where causality becomes obvious. The more the world grew, the more it eroded the very agreement that enabled its growth. And once that force kicked in, there was no reversing it. The real machinery of Bretton Woods was never in the conferences, the speeches, or the written agreements. It was in the structures no one could see. The system operated like a closed circuit. The dollar at the center. Gold as the illusion of balance. Countries locked into a mechanism that looked stable on the outside and unstable on the inside. The promised symmetry was a myth. The hidden architecture was built to advantage the one nation issuing the currency everyone else needed. That's the structural logic that shaped the post-war world. When dollars circulate globally, they don't disappear. They come back. First as reserves, then as credit. Finally as power. Foreign central banks weren't stockpiling gold. They were stockpiling American IOUs. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve became the only liquidity provider capable of keeping entire economies afloat. It wasn't a privilege. It was a flow monopoly. The architecture turned every exporter into a dependent, every importer into a debtor, every central bank into a risk manager for the United States. The weakest link was the anchor itself. The more dollars flowed out, the more pressure built on gold. The more countries grew, the more they tried to convert their reserves. The more conversions they demanded, the more the system groaned. It was an equation that could never hold. France saw it first. Germany saw it next. Japan saw it last. But they all reached the same quiet conclusion. The architecture only worked as long as no one tested the limits. And limits always get tested when growth accelerates. The US was financing a war, domestic expansion, consumption, and global reconstruction at the same time. That required monetary creation far beyond the physical capacity of America's gold supply. There was enough gold to maintain confidence. There wasn't enough gold to maintain the system. That difference is fatal in any monetary architecture. Meanwhile, another hidden mechanism was forming: the external dollar. Eurodollars, dollar deposits created outside US jurisdiction, expanded the global supply of dollars with zero corresponding gold backing. The system was doubling its own liquidity without doubling its base. It was the beginning of the structural multiplication that would later define modern financial capitalism. Commercial banks were issuing dollar credit outside the United States. Flows the US couldn't control, yet remained fully responsible for, because the promise of conversion was still theirs. This is the crucial gear almost no one talks about. Bretton Woods didn't break because politicians made mistakes. It broke because the system required infinite expansion supported by a finite anchor. The asymmetry grew quietly. Confidence grew fragile. And the first cracks appeared in the balance of payments, in the widening US deficit, and in the behind-the-scenes rush for gold. The system was under maximum tension, and no one wanted to admit it. The gears kept spinning, but the axis was already cracked. The invisible architecture was about to reveal its real cost. The break didn't start with an event. It started with a silent realization. The system had lost the ability to sustain its own promise. Gold convertibility still existed on paper, but in practice, it had become nothing more than a symbolic ritual. The world knew it. The United States knew it. And the clock was ticking toward the moment when denial would no longer be possible. Every new dollar issued pushed the system closer to its limit. Every rebuilt economy demanded more liquidity. Every country that grew intensified the pressure on America's gold. It was a race no one would admit was happening. When France requested conversion of its reserves into gold, it wasn't a hostile move. It was a diagnosis. The same diagnosis quietly repeated by other nations that were beginning to realize the foundation of the system wasn't solid. It was confidence stacked on top of confidence, resting on an anchor that no longer existed. The post-war math had run out. External liquidity was now many times larger than the available gold. The dollar could no longer be both things at once, the currency of one country and the monetary base of the entire planet. The asymmetry that built the global order was now eroding its pillars. The system was fulfilling the exact destiny embedded in its design, growing until it outgrew the structure meant to contain it. The break was inevitable. But inevitability doesn't arrive like an explosion. It arrives like exhaustion. One day the mechanism simply fails to close. And when that happens, the pillars don't collapse dramatically. They give way quietly. Confidence doesn't disappear all at once, it evaporates. In the end, Bretton Woods wasn't destroyed by the decisions made in 1971. It was destroyed by the decisions made in 1944. Decisions that created a model whose own success would eventually cause its collapse. That is the structural irony running through the whole history of money. The more efficient a system appears, the more fragile it becomes once it crosses the limits of its own logic. And that's exactly what happened. If this analysis makes sense to you, leave your thoughts. Your perspective adds depth to this investigation. The global order that emerged from this rupture shaped everything that came after. And understanding that shift is understanding what's about to happen again. If this episode clarified something for you, share your view in the comments and follow the next chapters. There's more to uncover.